All right, guys. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Results Loading podcast hosted by Prosperous AI. I'm your host, Michael Atkin, and today I am absolutely thrilled to have Karl Waggoner, a United States Air Force veteran with over 25 years of experience in project and supply chain management. Currently the Director of Supply Chain and Logistics at Mammoth Freighters. Karl has worked across aerospace, leading global supply chain initiatives and improving supplier performance. He's also recently completed his doctoral research on the effects of supply chain complexity on ESG performance. So I'll let him go into all those details later today. But Karl, welcome. Thanks so much for agreeing to be on the pod today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely, Karl. Looking forward to this one. Obviously, from one aviation buff to another, really looking forward to this one without a doubt. I want to dive right into it here. So how did your experience in the Air Force help shape your leadership and technical skills in the aerospace industry today? I mean, what are some of the biggest takeaways that you're still leaning on based on what you learned from that experience?
Yeah, there's kind of two different parts of it, but most of it's the feeling that you're part of something and that you own that thing, right? And so whatever they've assigned you to do, they trust you to do. And so I was a crew chief on Wild Weasels, which is McDonnell Douglas F4 E's and G's. And, you know, as a 17, 18-year-old kid, someone says, here, this multi-million-dollar weapons platform is now yours to manage. That makes you grow up fast. It makes you learn to take responsibility and to just organize your day. Because I was the second shift guy because I was low on the totem pole. And second shift doesn't go home until that plane is ready to fly for the next day. It has to be fully mission capable. So that ownership and just the sense of battle rhythm and the esprit de corps of that it's really about all of the people, all of the support that goes into it. Because I can't maintain that whole airplane myself. If I've got an issue with an ejection seat, I cannot perform service on an ejection seat. That's a highly specialized skill, and I need to make sure that I coordinate to get them out there. You know, getting the fuel unloaded, getting new drag chutes, doing inspections, all that stuff prepared me for just learning a battle rhythm and working my way through tasks and prioritizing them accordingly. And to not, even though I do rely on those functions, ultimately it's still my job to get that task completed.
And take us back actually to the beginning here real quick, Karl. How did we end up in the Air Force, and what was your primary role starting at the beginning and then all the way to when you exited the Air Force at the end?
Yeah, so I just did a single tour. I actually got out early under Graham Rudman. I entered the Air Force because, you know, I grew up in the 80s and we didn't have the internet, and so whatever you could kind of learn, whatever you could kind of grab as a vision was just from those around you. And so I grew up in the pretty poor, right? We've been on food stamps and all that. And so my line of sight on what my possibilities was pretty low. We didn't talk about college or any of that. But I had a few of the people that graduated from my school before me came back in their Air Force uniforms. And I'm like, you know, that looks like that would be, I do love my country. I do like the idea of serving. And I've always loved aircraft. So for me, the Air Force was a pretty great option. And I'm who I am is thanks to the Air Force. I was the best decision I could have made. I was working, you know, I did early in enlistment, so my mom had to sign a note to the recruiter saying that I could join.
Because it was before you were 18.
Yeah, because I graduated when I was 17, so I couldn't sign up myself. I had to have my mom's permission. uh, but my options were at the time. I had worked at Taco Bell, and I had been working in a factory, doing cleanup and light industrial tasks and stuff. And then I'm a restless soul at heart, and I have always wanted to see things and do things, and said, yeah, let's go do this. And
Let's do it.
yeah. So for me, it was a great step, and it was great to get it'll knock you out of your comfort zone. It forces you to work with people you don't know. It forces you to create more understanding with people that come from totally different backgrounds than you do, different cultures, different cities. So it'll grow you up quick. But that was kind of the thought process, was that partially a lack of options, partially a love of country and aircraft that drove me towards that.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention the discipline, the leadership skills, and all the other skills that came with that. But it ended up being like the greatest decision you could have ever made, because look at the illustrious career you've ended up having. That kind of all started with the Air Force, that we'll get into here in a moment. But I mean, would you credit that one decision when you're 17 to allowing you to kind of climb the professional ladder that you've done and end up where you are today?
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. It's where I met my wife. It's my brother ended up going in because of it. He ended up ascending to the highest enlisted rank he could, besides Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. So he was a Command Master Chief in the Washington Air National Guard. And so if I hadn't gone in, he wouldn't have gone in. And so, I mean, yeah, definitely. If you're a Doctor Who fan, it's a fixed moment in time, right? It just kind of had to happen.
Yeah, it set the table for like the rest of your life, which
Yep.
Which we love, and it's kind of cool to sit back and think about 25 years ago. That one decision when you're 17, you're like literally setting yourself up for everything, family,
Mm-hmm.
jobs. I mean, you checked all the boxes, which is fantastic.
Yep.
So, with that being said, Karl, what motivated you after the Air Force to transition from the military to a career in supply chain and logistics, and how did you adapt to that new field once leaving the Air Force?
Yeah, so it wasn't linear for sure. My career didn't follow some logical trajectory. And like I said, being Gen X, we were kind of, there's all of these, Gen X, jokes and things about how nobody cares about Gen X, and we're kind of left to our own devices. And in many respects, it's true that we are on the tail end of the 30 years in a gold watch type career approach, to where it was all becoming more about the value you could provide. And so I started, trying to think about what other skills I could add to the skills that I already had. And I started doing that. Now they call that, building a skill stack. But back then I didn't have a name for it, but I just thought, part of it was my natural restlessness and my relentless desire to learn more and to just do the best I can with whatever skills I have, do the next right thing, right? So yeah, I didn't end up in supply chain right after that. I got out, and civilian companies don't know how to translate MOSs to civilian jobs. So if you say I was a crew chief, they don't immediately think, oh, that person could be an aircraft mechanic, right?
Right.
You have to go get some other civilian credential to convince them that you can work on aircraft. So I had to go and get my airframe and power plant license from the FAA, and then I started working in maintenance, repair, and overhaul as a mechanic. And then I became an ops leader at a startup in Portland, and then the company went under in like 6 months. And so there's another transition point, and I'm like, well, I could just continue being a mechanic, but I had started taking pre-engineering classes before that, and I said, well, I'm going to do a Cortez and kind of burn the boats and sell all my tools, focus on this, take the pay cut, and learn to become a designer. So I became a designer and got an associate degree from the now defunct ITT Tech, and then got hired by Boeing sight unseen and went into design. And then lo and behold, Boeing was going to have a layoff. And so I had to pivot again and ended up in North Carolina in another MRO, but as a design engineer and liaison engineer. And from there, I got into more CAD CAM, CAE type functions, and worked for an IBM reseller / value added reseller, and consulted at automotive firms, mining firms. I worked on F-35, a bunch of different programs, just showing them how to use the different tools and then help them with processes and training and things like that. So that ended up then going back to Boeing after all of that, from North Carolina to Arizona, back to Boeing in Puget Sound, and got into training. We partnered with all of our process developers to build training for all of the engineering folks. And then I went back to school and got my bachelor's degree in technical project management and on 787. And then because of that, I was always helping the design engineers on 787, and then
like when the Dreamliner 787,
yeah.
right? How many years have passed between now you're working on the 787s, on the Dreamliners, and leaving the Air Force? How much time has passed?
Man, that had to have been so it was 2004 when I came back to Boeing. So that would have been 12 years from when I got that'd have been 14 years after I got out of the Air Force.
Okay. And then you went to Boeing, left, and now you're back at Boeing now.
Yep.
Got it. Not now today, of course, but where you're at in the story, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So it ended up back there. And then that's when I had the opportunity. I was working in training, and the people on the 87 really liked me and said, would you ever consider coming over here as a project manager? And I'm like, absolutely. So I would just I did a dog's breakfast of different projects on the 787, including like electromagnetic effects test regimes. And we had to sort out this problem where we were doing lightning testing and finding out that our design requirements left a gap in the safety. And I had to figure out the scope of the problem. So I had a team in Moscow and a team in Everett working 24 hours, and they were scouring the entire build for offsets from the skin. There was like a lightning issue. If lightning hit a fastener, it could attach to electrical systems. So like, how many places do we have this issue? So it was a massive thing. So just some really kind of cool, interesting projects. And then one of the guys that I worked for got promoted to a director of supply chain. And he said, and I was always really specific on my yearly evaluations about things I wanted to do. He said, I remembered on our last review, you said that you were interested in an international assignment. And he says, I could use you in either Italy or Japan. And my son has cystic fibrosis, and so it's really a Caucasian problem. So Japan wouldn't be very good for him getting therapy. So I said, we'd rather go to Italy. So they're like, okay, let's work it. So that's how I got into supply chain. Was I went over to work with a troubled supplier in Foggia, Italy, and best worst job of my life. It was just a complete mess. But yeah, but I mean, it was like talk about a crucible introduction to supply chain. Was just like, these guys aren't performing. Let's go over there and see how we can. And we transformed them from our worst supplier to one of our best. So that would have been 2009. So that was 19 years from when I left the Air Force, when I finally got into supply chain. But I loved it so much after we repatriated, I went to USC for my master's in global supply chain management. And then, through that, then the USC network is really strong. And so you stay in contact with everybody. Then that's how I ended up doing my doctorate, even though it didn't make any sense to me at the time. But it was pretty organic. I mean, it was kind of an organic transition. It wasn't anything I kind of set out, hey, I'd like to work in supply chain. But problem's a problem, and it really doesn't matter what the function was. So I did a lot of solving of problems. That's what my old boss used to call me, the break glass in case of emergency guy. And
the Swiss Army knife, if you will.
Yeah. So that's how I know that's a long journey to get there. But when I read that prompt, I'm like, that's not just a straight line. But
yeah, no, and it doesn't need to be a straight line, and a lot of it's not unique in some capacities. There's oftentimes not a plan for how we approach our career and how we get into the fields that we do. For people like you, Karl, who end up being the break glass if in case of emergency guy, just organically you ended up being really good at stuff. I mean, they threw you into Italy. It sounds like that was kind of trial by fire. I mean, they were throwing you into a gigantic disaster. You came out and
it had a non-specific root cause, right? And so like, okay, we have to tease apart all of the mitigating factors here of why this is such a mess. And part of it was we've met the enemy and they are us, right? It was like, we've really screwed them over on some of this stuff. No wonder they're such a mess. And we actually shut their clean room down for 1.5 years because the program was way behind. So imagine what that does to a producer who's put a bunch of money into building a big clean room for making composite parts, and not just composite parts, co-cured main boxes for a horizontal stabilizer. So 40-foot long co-cured boxes. The technology required to pull that off is substantial.
I can't imagine. And the project in Italy, or the job in Italy, that was with a partner, right, or a vendor?
Mm-hmm. So the 787 was the first one where Boeing had what they called risk-sharing partners. And so there was FHI and KHI in Japan, and then Alenia in Italy. And part of the reason they went to Italy was because the Italians really bailed out Boeing on the 767 program. So,
which has since been discontinued, right? They're not building the 76s anymore, are they?
No, they still are. Yeah,
they're building new 76s.
Yeah, KC-46.
Oh, you're kidding. For commercial airliners as well.
I don't know if they finished all of the FedEx converted freighters or not, but they're still rolling out KC-46s. Those are brand new airplanes. So they come together, and they either go to they go down the line, and at a certain point they have to bifurcate into either KC-46 or a freighter.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I didn't know that, but curious, given you were kind of in the midst of all of that, some of the best practices that you developed for supplier performance evaluation and improvement. They threw you into the fire in Italy, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that, how you went over and cleaned everything up, if you will, and what impact you specifically had and what your takeaways were from that experience specifically?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you have to have when you're trying to solve a big problem like that is that both sides need to agree what the problem is. If you're working two different problems, then you'll never come to a solution. So we tried to be as put it as broad as possible to contain all of the issues, but specific enough to know where do we start, right? And start chewing it down. And we had two different buildings there. One was for assembly and one was for fabrication of the composite main box, and they both had their own needs, their own leaders and supply chain and everything. So we kind of had to try to tease those apart. But really, in all of my career, the key thing is understanding the problem statement. What am I trying to make better here? Because we can often create KPIs and measures that don't even really measure something that moves the needle, right? We had a saying at Boeing, and I found it to be axiomatically pretty true, is what gets measured gets done. So be very careful in setting your target. What are you trying to hit? And by kind of understanding the problem statement and setting the target accurately, then your remedies should serve hitting that target, right? So having that problem and then being able to break it down and understanding and having a plan, and I am very consistent everywhere I go that there are 5 main elements to a plan. You can have more, you can have less, but you do not have a plan without these 5 elements. And that means that you have all the tasks identified, you have an owner for all of those tasks, they have a date that they're supposed to be done, it's written down, and it's commonly understood. If you have those 5 things, you have a plan. If you don't have one of those things, don't tell me you have a plan. And I get people argue with me, and then I ask them, which of those do you think we don't need? And then they're like, yeah, I guess you're right. And because it isn't a plan if everybody doesn't understand it. It isn't a plan if you don't have a time when you're thinking you're going to be done. If someone doesn't own the task, it sure as heck isn't going to get done. So those are some of the major things that I learned through that experience. But number one is that you always have to start with the people, and building relationships with the people, especially in Italy. That was even more important because work is like 7 on their list of priorities, right?
Yeah, I mean, in Europe across the board, seemingly.
So learning to build relationships and I had to slay a few of my sacred cows, right? That things that I thought were just super important, and sometimes it hurts me in the States because I got into where I realized that time wasn't necessarily as critical as we make it seem in the United States. And in the States, people take it as a personal affront if you're late or something like that. That is not the case for the Italians.
Yeah.
They neither take offense to it or overly respect it, right? If you're meeting at 10:30 and there's still a 10 in the time, then you're still on time. If you get there at 10:59, right? But you got to start with people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it does sound simple, but still really crucial in terms of getting stuff done, especially critical projects like what you were overseeing, having the 5 steps or the 5 elements to a plan, having the people, the organization. I mean, they sound like obvious things, but you'd be surprised how many other PMs and companies and the way they go about, conducting business aren't as organized, and they just don't have these elements in place that are simple but are crucial for the completion of the project. And I think it's important to reiterate sometimes, like, yeah, it sounds cliche, yeah, it sounds simple, but oftentimes those simple things are slept on a little bit too much. That's interesting that you get any sort of pushback when someone comes to you and says, hey, I got a plan, and you're like, okay, what do you have? Talk to me about it. And they're missing 3 of the 5 steps. And it's like,
having done decades of project management, it's also, really important to right size your approach, because there's a huge palette of tools you can draw from and for project management technique, and you just want to use the minimum effective dose, right? I don't need a giant Gantt chart to manage a 1 month project, right? I can throw a bunch of tasks into a Jira board and just manage it that way. It still has all of the elements of a plan, but it's much simpler, and doesn't require 2 days of upfront work to get it going.
Yeah, that's the beauty of Jira. I'd say we use Jira as well, and it's definitely a game changer for small companies and large, I'd imagine. And obviously, when you're breaking it down into teams, it makes things significantly easier.
Sure, yeah.
Doesn't take that much. It doesn't need to be like a year of planning. You can just get organized and get to it.
I've done both. At Lilium, we used what I called Scrummer Fall, where we had a master phasing plan that was in a Deltek open plan, and then we had an interface between our Jira boards and the major bars, and it would sum up all the activity from all of those Jira boards and say how far along we were on that bar. It was beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful. And as a project manager, I bet it's the things that dreams are made of for PMs, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I love good progress indication.
Of course. And Carl, that kind of bleeds me into my next item of conversation that I wanted to discuss with you about in terms of new technology. And as a project manager, you're in supply chain, you're in logistics, you've done project management, you have an engineering background, you really a jack of all trades, like we discussed. Break glass in case of emergency. That is very much what you represent. But how have technologies really influenced your work in supply chain management? How have you leveraged them to make a positive impact in terms of progress, like we just discussed, and making sure that we're pushing the ship forward in the right direction and at the right pace?
Yeah, I mean, tools change year to year. I can remember starting with just the early iterations of project, and then moving into agile project management. Those are kind of project management tools, but I think I've really transformed being able to manage teams is the collaboration infrastructure that's emerged with Teams and Slack and I think it was the other one, Asana. Some of those are really helpful, and can really help move stuff forward. We use Planner kind of relentlessly to keep track of tasks, because we have a pretty high variability right now with a development environment, so things don't always kind of run in the right sequence. And managing a lot of different suppliers, having a quick way to assign tasks and track progress is really helpful. Use Microsoft lists a lot we have like a daily Obeya that we run to go through and set priorities for operations every day.
Sure.
And those technologies are really helpful.
Well, then you're in supply chain and logistics, so you're dealing with a lot of data points as well. I mean, how are you like adopting AI? Are we managing the data points to ensure like maximum productivity and efficiency across, the fleet, for example, or in terms of when things need to get from point A to point B logistics wise, that kind of ends up on your desk? I mean, how are you managing that effectively to ensure the efficiency and productivity is staying at the level that you require?
So we're in an interesting segment of the industry, right? We're not an OEM. Our cycles our development cycles are long. Well, aerospace in general has long development cycles. And so we're not doing the hundreds a year of aircraft that Boeing is going to be doing. And we're also having to adjust based on availability of what we call feedstock. So these aircraft are ending their lives as commercial aircraft, and then they're going to come here to be modified. So we we have to identify the feedstock, and then we have to, do all the stripping of that aircraft and get all that scheduled. And then as we're building, we have I'd say a 98% understanding of how that aircraft's configured, but there's always stuff as you're coming in and surveying an as-built aircraft that you're going to have to make changes, build one-off parts, that kind of thing. So the variability is much higher in our world than it is in an OEM world. Our goal is like 20 aircraft this coming year, which is still a lot for a wide body freighter conversion effort. But we're not at the level of like automotive rates or electronic rates where you can really leverage AI, and AI is heavily dependent on the data set that you have.
Absolutely.
Right? And if you're in the, we're in the development cycle right now, so we don't have a lot of data that I could really leverage AI for. I mean, I do use it a lot for like writing and building business intelligence based on the back end data that comes out of our ERP system. But it's pretty light right now as to how useful it can be, because AI is neither artificial nor intelligent in my estimation. It's not artificial because it's managed by somebody. Somebody gives it the algorithms, tells it what goals it needs to seek and work towards. It's not intelligent. It iterates. You have to have a good data set to go with and iterate off of. And you have to have enough knowledge to know whether it's garbage that you're getting out of,
or if it's hallucinating, or if it's even accurate. Sure.
Yeah. But the intelligence would imply that it had some meaning and goal of its own that it developed, and it just we're not even sniffing that. I think they've way oversimplified human thought processes and what intelligence actually means. So I use it pretty. I'm not afraid of it. I'm perfectly willing to use it. I use ChatGPT probably on a regular basis, and I use it it's a great tool. I mean, because it can simplify tasks, and I won't hesitate to use it if I think that it can be useful in the future. As we build our data sets and start having trends and things that I can leverage with AI, absolutely, it'll be part of our tool set. And we have a pretty small and lean team, so anything we can leverage, any technology we can leverage to make that work better, we'll use.
And so just so I'm clear, Karl, in terms of what Mammoth does, are you guys buying 777s? So I believe you're just buying the 200 and 300s, right? The extended range and the long range from airliners who are retiring that specific model, stripping them and turning them into freighters and then selling them? Are you guys actually doing the shipping and managing all the shipping operations as well?
So we own the supplemental, or we're developing and we'll own the supplemental type certificate, and we provide the kit for doing the modification. And then we hire an MRO to do the labor part of it.
Okay, but you guys aren't you're not like FedEx or UPS or anything. When you're not shipping large freight or anything like that.
These will be operated by whoever we've sold them to. So we got our start by buying 10 Delta 777s that they were going to get rid of. So we do own 10, but we've since sold some of those back because the things picked back up again and people needed them for rev service. So we ended up selling those, which was good. That gives us some operating capital as we're doing all of our development. But those are still going to come back and be modified and be operated by somebody. So we have a customer that says, I want to convert an airplane, and besides the ones that we own, they're going to identify the feedstock that they want to use. Now we have a huge feedstock database, so we know all of the 777s that are out there from ours that could work for us. So the 200LR is actually the sweetest, the killer app, but they didn't make as many of them. They made way more of the 300 ERs.
Right.
Yeah. So, but it's still going to be a great airplane. It's the largest door in the industry. Yeah, it's a good airplane. So we'll sell quite a few of them, but we're not going to stop with 777s. We're looking at other wide body platforms as well. So.
Sure, but ultimately the goal is to acquire, strip them, reconfigure them, and then sell them. Ultimately, is what you're doing.
We generally sell them before that, right? We have a customer that says, I want a freighter, and then we work with them to identify feedstock. They buy the airplane and we do the mod and everything.
Got it.
Yeah.
Do you guys ever think in terms of your expansion? I know you're just doing the 777s right now. Are you just doing Boeing models, or would you ever do get into the Airbus area as well?
No, we'd consider it. Yeah.
Because the A350 is technically the biggest the biggest wide body twin engine plane out there now, right? The A350 1000 is bigger than the 777, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the 777X, the -9, that sucker will be huge. But it's not they'll be brand new. So, but we need them to start delivering those and selling those, because that's what'll help with the feedstock crunch, right? Because people they'll start retiring the 200s and 300s and buying 8s and 9s. A350-1000, I think, would be like one of the longest wide bodies, but it's not. It's the same tube size as a 87, so they're a little smaller than 777s.
Oh, it is. Okay, interesting. I thought it was the biggest, as well as had the greatest distance capabilities, but I know they're mainly being used for commercial airliners now.
We'd actually, there's one of the folks that works here had done a proposal for an A380 combi freighter. So it had, like, you could run a full deck of passenger and a full deck of freight.
A freight underneath it.
And yeah, and it was an Airbus design study. So
interesting.
But yeah, people have gone away from 4 engines because they're not as safe as twin engines, ironically.
And not as efficient either, of course.
Not as efficient. And it requires more crew if you have 4.
Why aren't they as safe? I didn't know that. More
because
risk, I guess.
If you think about failure modes analysis, most of your catastrophic failure modes are due to engines.
Interesting.
And so if you double the number of engines, you've doubled the number of failure modes.
The potential. Got it.
Yeah.
But Karl, I want to give us a second and an opportunity to talk about your doctoral degree that you recently completed. Congratulations, by the way, again on that. Can you share some of the findings and can you just talk about your process, the last 6 years you spent working on it, and how it kind of relates to your current role, more or less?
Sure. So I got interested in it when I was taking a supply chain sustainability class at USC. And so that professor actually ended up being a second reader on my dissertation. But what I wondered, what my hypothesis was, if there's complexity in a supply chain, does increasing that complexity make it harder to be sustainable? Basically, is the overall the thrust of what I'm asking. But you have to hone it down. So it was examining the relationships between supply chain complexity and ESG scores as a proxy for sustainability, right? And so there's a big like a terminal that business analysts use called Bloomberg Terminal, right? And it has just a slew of different ratings and information on businesses. And so what I focus just on U.S. businesses and the the things I used for proxies for complexity was number of suppliers. So and I could only use tier 1 suppliers, which was another limitation of the study. You could dig down deeper, but you had to have way more product knowledge of which chains you were chasing. So it was tier 1 supply chains, and the number of those suppliers that were foreign suppliers. And so the number of suppliers was one, the number of different countries that were represented, and then there were other measurements like ratings from the State Department on the human trafficking indexes and things like that. And so those different factors were used as measures for year over year. Did that change based on by the number of suppliers it had in foreign countries? Now, the other limitation is it's only a 3-year data set. If I were to conduct more research, I'd go back and grab more years and see if the trends kind of still hold. But overall, what I found was it didn't make a lot of difference. And in some respects, having more different countries actually kind of improved their ESG scores. After the findings, one of the things that I concluded was, well, a couple things. It's very difficult to have a consistent rating system for all of these different factors. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And really, to me, the one that moves the lever the most is the governance part of it. If you have good management, and then you're going to have good ESG performance, I think. Number 2, I called it my quantum entanglement theory, is that things change just by observing them. So by the fact that they're a publicly held company and they measure their ESG, I think that it improves their performance by proxy. Just the act of measuring it improves.
Just because they know people are watching and they're under the radar.
Exactly. That, that it's the what gets measured gets done theory. That when you start measuring it, then you start improving it just by proxy, by knowing what you're doing.
Exactly.
You can apply that to weight loss, right? When you start writing down the meals that you eat, you just organically start eating less because you're paying attention to it. So I think those factors are at play, but I would like to do more of a longitudinal study and even more of a deeper dive into the lower levels of their supply chains, because I think that would really reveal some interesting insights, because that's one of the hardest things for someone that has an extended supply chain or a very complex supply chain. If you were to trace that down into like raw mineral extraction and stuff, I think you'd start seeing some things that you could clean up, and I think we could improve the measurement of those things, how to interrogate them better and get better answers, if that's important to you. And so that doesn't even include all the privately held companies, right?
Right.
We didn't even measure that. And there is a little bit of a bias for European countries. Their rating systems, they rate European countries higher than they do American companies, because there's a perception that Europe is greener than the US.
Yeah,
so
because of the environmental aspect, I was going to guess.
Yeah. And having worked there, there's definitely a focus on it. As to whether I think they're really making any difference, it's marginal. Because some of the things that they really emphasize, I'm not sure they make that big a difference in the grand scheme of.
At the end of the day, yeah.
But it's interesting. I would love to do consulting on like a sustainability think tanks, or just consulting with businesses that really wanted to improve it, how they could measure it more effectively. Because I don't think it needs to be the main thing, but I also think that if you want to be a good corporate citizen, you should be concerned about your people. You should be concerned about how you impact the world, and how do you want to face the world and operate as a company. So
No, absolutely. And congrats again. I know, it was a pain like we discussed before we got started here, but I'm glad you got it through it. And it's, PhD, no small feat. So that's fantastic. Do you see yourself pursuing further data and further research given you're so deep into the data
I
at
do.
this point?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've already been talking with my chairs about publishing the results and then doing further research into it. I'd also like to do some teaching as well. USC has expressed some interest in having me do some adjunct teaching there as well as Northeastern. So that was one of the reasons I thought it would be a good idea to pursue it. That as I become an older and older fart, have some options, things I can do. You know, I'm almost to the point where I kind of don't have to work. I'm working because I like it.
Yeah, plenty of
And
options.
but like I said, I'm a restless soul and I'm always learning and reading. And so as long as I think I can make a meaningful contribution, I'm just going to keep rolling. I don't puttering around a garden doesn't interest me.
Sure.
I do like traveling. I have friends all over, so I do like to do that. So we'll see what the future holds in that.
And Carl, as we wrap up here, I'm curious, did you ever think the 17-year-old you ever think who was literally going to the Air Force with his mom, ever think that you would end up with this illustrious career and background that you have today, PhD, work at several huge companies, made major impact on all of them? I mean, did that 17-year-old ever think that you would end up where you are today?
I don't know how. I mean, like I said, I grew up in pretty modest environment, and so it wasn't anything that really that I even thought about. Um, but I always had a kind of an extreme ownership view of my skill set, and I thought, and I try to inculcate my son with this, not to tell him he needs to go a certain direction, but you have gifts that you've been given, and there's lots of people that don't have those gifts, and you should honor those gifts by using them to the best of your ability. Do the best you can. Always do the next right thing, and don't compare yourself to other people because they're not you. That's not they don't have that same door that was open. They don't have the same skills that you do. Um, but you can just take those and just go do the best you can. And I mean, I think even if you had asked me before I started this job whether I thought I'd even be doing this, I probably would have told you no. Uh, just because I'd been working at it so long, and um, the Boeing company they've pivoted what they prioritize when they're looking for leadership attributes, and there's many of those attributes I don't have, even with a doctorate, that they still don't value because of other attributes that I possess, and that's too bad. Hoping they'll change that and it'll become more of a meritocracy over there again, because I really do want them to do well. But this job was a total lightning bolt. Could not have foreseen it. I was asked to interview for it by someone I worked for 23 years ago, and it kind of highlighted the importance of always being kind to people, and that people will always remember how you made them feel more than they will remember what you did, what your skills were, and all that. And I think that opened the door for me, that he remembered that I left him with a good feeling whenever he interacted with me. And you can see the skills that someone has by their resume, right? But you can't necessarily get a sense of who they are. And
Way more important. I had a guy on the podcast yesterday say he still remembers some of the lessons his mentor taught him like 35 years ago.
yeah,
35. That's not like 5 or even 15. 35 years ago, he still utilizes some of those techniques and lessons today. And you're exactly right. It just goes to show, people don't really remember the resume. They remember how you made them feel and what takeaways there were that, last apparently a lifetime, 35 plus years later.
yeah. I mean, I've been blessed to work with some of the just most fantastic people. Those are the things that I always take with me in all my transitions. I wish I could just, bring all those people with me everywhere I went, because they made such a, positive influence in my life. And, I've left chunks of my heart in Germany and Italy and other places. And that's okay. If you have a chunk of, I think if you have a bunch of people and places that you miss, that means that you've had a good life. Right?
Yeah, and you did well. And like you said, if you do call it quits someday or start doing some teaching on the side, plenty of places to travel where you know people, luckily for you.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm very blessed that way. And I have the best job at Mammoth. I really believe that. I have a fantastic team. Yeah, love what I do. And, it's been a circuitous journey to get here, but really glad to be here. I love being able to do stuff like this and chat with people. And if anything I say can be helpful to someone else, then that's good stuff.
Exactly. And that's kind of the point of the results loading podcast here. And I think you've definitely done that today, Karl. I really appreciate the time today. This has been absolutely fantastic, insightful, enjoyable, all of it from start to finish. I've really enjoyed our conversation. So thanks so much for joining today, and good luck to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Have a good one.
Yeah, likewise, Karl. Take care.